Good morning, everybody. I'm so glad you could join me. You're probably wondering, what am I doing outside in seemingly the middle of the night here with a candle? I have come here to set the mood for the most amazing piece of music you may have never heard of. It's the zenith of the Romantic movement itself, full of color, full of life, full of nature. That is Marx's Eine Herbstsymphonie. But before we can talk so much about the symphony, I think it's important that we address the historical context, or at least the musical context, because this was in the middle of one of the most interesting periods in music history. Eine Herbstsymphonie was written in 1921, right in the middle of one of the wildest periods of classical music, which I would say stretches from 1910 to 1935. That was when you had kind of a purgatory between Romanticism and modernism, because after the death of Mahler, that pretty much signified the end of the Romantic movement as we know it. You still had lingering romantics like Franz Schmidt or Richard Strauss, or even to an extent someone like Joseph Marx. But at the same time, you couldn't really say the Romantic movement was the same after Mahler. But on the other hand, you had the modern composers that immediately come to mind, people like Ives, people like Schoenberg, people like Stravinsky. For them, they either weren't popular or they hadn't quite reached the level of modernism with which we associate them. As a result, that leaves about a 20-year gap from 1910 to 1930 or so, right before World War II, where composers were doing so many different things that it's kind of ridiculous, and you can't help but be jealous of musical circles around that time. On one hand, you had kind of the early modernists, people like Ruth Crawford Seeger or Charles Ives, who were developing the proto-modernism sound before most people really got into it. You had kind of the lingering nationalists, someone like Joaquin Rodrigo in Spain or Ottorino Respighi in Italy, and they kept on developing the nationalistic movement way back to even the medieval era, not necessarily focusing on folk music, but focusing on the early classical music of their respective countries. You had the lingering romantics, as I said, like Richard Strauss and Franz Schmidt. You had the people over in the Americas, for instance, who were developing their own country's vernacular. Someone like Heitor Villa-Lobos in Brazil, or you have Agustin Barrios Mangoré in Paraguay. And in America, of course, you have someone like Gershwin, Copeland, or Florence Price. They were all developing their own unique vernacular. You had the Russians, who were doing their own thing with the Five, which then developed into the neoclassicism of people like Stravinsky, Shostakovich, and Prokofiev and Kabalevsky. You also had Scandinavia, where you had the development of two very different camps. You had the lingering nationalists like Hugo Alfvén or Wilhelm Stenhammar in Sweden, or Levi Madetoja and Jean Sibelius in Finland, and they were still developing that nationalistic, folksy style that we might associate with someone like Dvorak back in Czechia a few generations earlier. But then you also had sort of mysticists, very weird composers like Ruud Langgaard or Ture Rangström, who were developing a very unique sound that wasn't super modern sounding today, but was very progressive for Scandinavia at the time. You also had the two opposing groups that were influenced by Scriabin. You had groups that were influenced by early Scriabin like Rachmaninoff, Metner, Bortkovich, and Kosenko. And on the other hand, you have the more late Scriabin-influenced people, someone like Feinberg or Protopopov or Roslovets. And they had their own later Scriabin sound that was very nutty in a somewhat different way than Scriabin, definitely developing his sound further had Scriabin been able to live longer. Finally, there's my favorite of them all, and the one that we are going to talk about today. That is the Decadent movement. The Decadent movement is like if Debussy didn't disavow the German composers. Because Debussy was kind of unique, same with Ravel and Cras and Séverac and the other Impressionist composers of the era. They all wanted to develop a mostly French sound. All of these composers were French, and they wanted to have their own vernacular, like the composers of the Americas at this time. But then you had someone like Franz Schreker, or Erich Wolfgang Korngold, or Alexander von Semlinsky. These three composers are the primary names of the Decadent movement, and they wrote lots of colorful, very romantic, very chromatic operas. And it comes together in a way that sounds like Wagner and Debussy had a wonderful baby, and that baby was an opera. I don't know how that works, just go with it. And it comes across so beautifully. It's often associated with the decadent movement in art, which is all about color, even to a detrimental extent. It talks a bit about the fall of society, and it's all about overindulgence in a specifically good thing. And me, maybe I'm decadent, but I love it so, so much. I don't know about you, but I would consider the prototype for a piece from the decadent movement to be Ravel's La Valse. It is very much in that vein because it has the excessive color and it has a little bit of the Germanic influence, and it's very, very fun in a way that does almost feel a bit hedonistic, even though it's just music. And this is something that's unique about this work because it's not true of all decadent movement pieces. It's true of some by Schrecker and some by Zemlinsky, but this one actually does indulge in the other meaning of decadent, that is to say, something about like the fall of society due to immorality. It's all about a utopia which falls apart due to overindulgence in good things. And for that reason, combined with the sheer style of the piece, which is like if Johann Strauss was bastardized by a big rainbow, is the best way I can come up with saying it. That's kind of what the decadent movement came to sound like. So that's a pretty good example. I mean, the decadent movement. We hear the word and we think it's got to be all about lavish music and social destruction, right? No, no. I mean, the lavish music, absolutely, but the whole fall of society thing from the other meaning of decadent certainly does not apply as much when it comes to the music. It might sound overindulgent because to a degree it really, really is. There are a lot of people who don't like it because of that. They feel like it's almost too sweet. It's saccharine. And I don't agree with that as much. I can kind of see where they're coming from. And really, it's just all about the sound. It's a very extensively colorful sound, like the Germans took on the Impressionistic movement. The figurehead of this movement, even though he died before it really took off, is Max Reger. He has everything that you're looking for: the dense polyphony, the extensively chromatic harmonies, and then the very, very rich colors, especially seen in his orchestral music, like Die Nonnen or Gesang der Verklärten, which all really shows off what you expect in a decadent movement piece. And really, the main composers of this era were people like Schrecker, Korngold, and Zemlinsky, as I mentioned. You also had people like Walter Bricht, Walter Braunfels, Eugen d'Albert, and then the pinnacle of it all, the logical extreme of all of these composers' styles, Joseph Marx himself. So, what is there to say about Joseph Marx? Simple. He's the extreme. Every single movement as far back as the Baroque era had a composer or a piece that took a movement to its logical extreme. Like, think of early Baroque sacred music. The logical extreme of that would be something like the Masses of Heinrich Ignaz Franz von Bieber, which have giant instrumental groups, giant choruses, and very elementary harmony in a way that you might expect from someone like Handel. With all due respect to Handel, I love him, so no offense. You also see this with something like Beethoven's Eroica Symphony, which is considered the turning point from the classical period to the Romantic period. But in my opinion, I think it just expresses the greatest exaggeration of the classical period, at least the late classical symphony. Or you can even have someone like Furtwängler, the better known as a conductor, and you can see why with his compositions, because really, they're just Bruckner to a logical extreme. And that's the same with Marx and the decadent movement. And we're going to explore that comparison with his pinnacle of his entire oeuvre, his magnum opus, and the zenith of the Romantic movement itself, Eine Herbstsymphonie. So I'm going to yada yada through the symphony, at least its material. I'll get into it why in a second. But first, let me say two things. One, listen to the recording on the CPO label. It has the best sound balance, so you can really hear the winds in balance with the rest of the orchestra, and that's really necessary for a piece like this. You'll see why when you hear it. And then, too, don't listen to it like a symphony, because really, it's not that symphonic in terms of its form. That's one of the things about Joseph Marx that is heavily criticized, at least this piece in particular, because it does not have the typical symphonic form. You couldn't really notice if it was in sonata form, for instance. It doesn't really have the typical development of themes that you might expect in any of its movements, to be quite frank. Most of the themes are reappearing throughout, and in that, it's more like a symphonic tetraptych. That is to say, four pieces that are kind of symphonic in scope, if not in form, that are tied together through a commonality. In this case, the portrayal of autumn. And it's much more poetic, like four symphonic poems. In the same way that Ernst Beria had his Odysseus tetralogy. I'll get into that piece one day. Or even Alexander von Semlinsky's Die Seejungfrau, which is in three movements. I'd say that piece is a bit better tied together, but it's in three movements, and you can't really play them without the others for context. Although the finale of Marx's symphony is played on its own, but that's because you can kind of understand the piece as separate entities a little bit more than something like Zemlinsky's Seejungfrau. So I said I'm not going to talk too much about the symphony and its material itself, and that's for a simple reason. You see, Joseph Marx's Eine Herbstsymphonie is almost like a computer screen. If you look away from a distance, a computer screen will appear to you as one single cohesive identity with no particular pixel standing out. But if you take maybe a microscope to it, or even just look at it very closely, you'll see the individual pixels, and you'll see the colors that radiate from it, and you'll see that this is not necessarily just one cohesive identity, but it is also one work that is made up of very, very small components that come together to make something greater. Now, that may just sound like I'm talking about the standard symphony, but I would argue that Joseph Marx's Eine Herbstsymphonie is a lot more homogeneous than any other that you've probably heard. Within a traditional symphony, you will see a lot more immediate contrast, be it in terms of dynamics, in terms of tempo, in terms of timbre. That's not how this work really goes. Instead, Joseph Marx does something that I really, really love. He goes from idea to idea very slowly, ensuring that there is no very immediate contrast outside of, really, I can't think of anything other than going from movement to movement, specifically the second to the third movement and the third to the fourth, because the first and second movements are attacca. And other than that, other than the movement differences, you really just go from very different ideas in a way that flows so nicely that you don't even notice you're there until it happens. And once you get there, it's like you kind of fell asleep while driving. And then you think, how did I get to this point? Because you just can't really believe how subtle his movement is in this symphony. So now let's talk about Joseph Marx the guy. Joseph Marx was born in 1882 in Austria, where he studied and spent most of his life. He picked up the piano at a young age, and most of his songs for which he's best known were composed in his 20s. And if you don't know him, then that's okay, because he's not that well known nowadays, but kind of like Lorenzo Perosi, he was a rock star back in his day. His songs were played all around Europe. You can still find some of the best known singers in the recorded era that sang some of his individual songs. He ultimately faded from popularity due to being falsely labeled as a Nazi, because of the fact that he stayed in Nazi Germany during their reign, which isn't a good look, obviously. But he did have friends like Schrecker and Korngold who were Jewish, which wasn't something that someone like Wagner would do, who wrote an entire manifesto about how much he hated Jewish composers. Now, if you look at his group of friends, similar to Perosi again, it's amazing to see the amount of admirers he had and their diversity. You had Puccini, Schoenberg, Ravel, Richard Strauss, Respighi, Korngold, Schrecker, Alban Berg, Erkki Melartin, Mettner, and Szymanowski. That is a diverse set of musicians. So what is the style that unified them? Let's hear it. From the very first second of music, Joseph Marx establishes the grand truth of this work. It's not music. One cannot easily extract the simple even the simplest aspects of music from this work. It's very difficult to extract themes, progressions, periods, or rhythms. One of the things that makes me urge people not to listen to Eine Herbstsymphonie as a symphony is that fact. With a symphony, you will probably eagerly seek out the appearance of certain themes or motifs that you've heard. But that's not really true here. This is a lot more like Sejongfrau or the Beria piece that I'm hoping to discuss someday, or better-known works like Debussy's La Mer or Respighi's Roman Trilogy. Even with those works, however, you can easily break them up into individual aspects, smaller parts of a bigger movement. You can't really do that with Marx. Each individual movement can hardly be broken up because they're similar in mood enough, and even for greater contrasts in mood, you move in such a way that you couldn't really separate them because you need the full context. Like with Respighi's Pines of Rome, you'll often see, maybe on Spotify or whatever streaming service you want to use for music, you'll see individual tracks within the work. If you try to do that with Joseph Marx, which you can do it technically, it's possible, but it's very, very stupid because you can't really listen to any individual aspect of the work without the greater context. At least not a single movement, certainly not. So I know I said that it's hard to extract themes from this work, and I completely stand by that. But there are certain themes that arch over the whole work as an entirety, not necessarily specific movements, which you won't really find is true with this symphony. The first one is actually a melody that encapsulated Marx's entire career. You'll see it in multiple of his works, and that is the first melody that is played after the intensely thick pattern played in the percussion. I would call it the Marx theme, because it appears in this work. It also appears in Verklärtes Jahr, his song cycle, and you can probably find other instances in his music. I'm yet to find them, but I'm sure they're present. And it's a very clever reference because Verklärtes Jahr means transfigured year. It talks a bit about the cycle of the year, and the Autumn Symphony is talking about autumn. So this might just be a very, very clever reference on Marx's part. The melody is played over that orchestral ostinato, but you could not really call that harmony because of just how weird it is. Because you listen to it and you get a vague idea of what key you're in. You're in B minor for the most part. But there are so many different rhythms, so many non-chord tones, that you can't really call it harmony. In reality, it's just more of an ostinato. And one of the genius things he does here is Marx wants this symphony to flow. I've discussed this so much at this point. And this has to show up in the ostinato. So what does he do? He creates intense polyrhythms. While one instrument plays 3 notes in a span, another instrument plays 4, another plays 5, another plays 6. And that way, no single note is distinguishable. No instrument is necessarily distinguishable from the rest. And that's part of what makes the work feel so homogeneous. Now, it wasn't just the harmonies that he had in common with other Sybaritic German post-romantics. It was also his long melodies. That main melody I talked to you about is in 2 phrases in 1 period, at least as I distinguish it. You could probably say that it's in more phrases. You could even just say it's one continuous phrase, because other than when it changes instruments and changes range, it doesn't really have any moments for respite. So it's 2 phrases in 1 period, as I call it. How long do you think it is? 10 seconds? 15 seconds? Nope. 2 phrases, 1 period. It lasts for 45 seconds because it sweeps in such a way that undulates, and it just doesn't really allow you to take a breath. And that's fine, because if I'm going to drown, I'm okay in drowning in the music of Joseph Marx. I think the melody part is where it's really important to talk about why Marx was very big on kind of disavowing form in his later works. Because if you've taken a certain amount of music theory courses in your life, then you'll know all about phrase structure, why it's so important, and you've probably even done a lot of analysis of people like Mozart or Haydn or Beethoven, or some of their other contemporaries. Now, by 1921, when Marx wrote this piece, this was very much not a thing anymore. Most composers probably weren't looking for the typical 4-bar phrase or longer periods that come in multiples of 2. Instead, him and his contemporaries, people like Reger, Delius, Debussy, and Ravel, they weren't really looking for that phrase structure. They were just looking to write melodies that sounded nice, and that's how it should be. His melodies can technically be split into phrases and periods, but like trying to split up the movement into smaller lengths of time, it's not a good idea because you don't really get the whole idea. It wasn't supposed to be good in form. It wasn't looking to have any form at all. In fact, I think it's best to look at a quote by Debussy. Let's read it. I am more and more convinced that music, by its very nature, is something that cannot be cast into a traditional and fixed form. The rest is a lot of humbug invented by frigid imbeciles riding on the backs of the masters. And that tells us that Joseph Marx is being intentional in his choice to disavow form. So that melody in 2 parts plays twice. The first time it's got I think it's bassoons, bass clarinet, and cellos playing the first time, and then it's flutes and violins playing the second time. It's a similar deal when you have the second repeat of the entire melody, but this time it changes its key, and it also changes in the way that the ostinato becomes a bit more aggressive with more non-chord tones and a lot of polytonality that is so subtle you don't even really notice it if you're not paying very close attention to the music. Now, this high density is very good for the color, and it really allows you to envision yourself kind of in an autumn idyll alongside a flowing river, alongside flying birds and tall leafy trees. And it's just so beautiful. I am personally a very emotional listener. I am a romantic personality, and I don't listen to music for the formal aspects. I like to close my eyes and let the music paint pictures in my mind. And I've never had a work do that as well as Marx's Herbstsymphony. From then on, the first movement does a lot of the same stuff. It undulates beautifully, but more or less, I think it's better to save it as a surprise because, as I talked about with the computer screen analogy, I'm either going to not talk about the material at all, or I'm going to talk about it for longer than the symphony itself, which is 66 minutes, so not exactly an easy feat. So mostly I thought I'll just save a lot of the material as a surprise. But I will say, after the 2 themes, the material slowly migrates back to B minor, where the main theme is played in a canon, and then we keep up that undulation until about 8 minutes and 10 seconds into the first movement, where we keep the very dense textures, because of course we do. If you don't know Marx, that is his thing. He has probably the densest textures of a non-modern composer that I've ever heard. And by 8:10, it goes to a lot higher, like you have violin trills and flute runs, and that's how we get to the second movement. I'm glad I picked Ravel's La Valse as the piece that represents the decadent movement, because really, that's what the second movement sounds like. It's very much based on the typical Straussian waltz format. This is a waltz, by the way, except it's very, very colorful and has a lot denser harmonies, a lot more chromatic harmonies, and it's so beautiful. There's a very nice melody in here, and unlike the first movement, I think that you could reasonably extract this melody, and I would love to use it in my own work. I wish I came up with something like that. And it dances around in a lot happier of a way. You have kind of like fleeting pictures that make you think of a deer skipping across a meadow or a bird flying into the trees. The various little figurations that come and go just for a few seconds are really what make this symphony so evocative. It's part of what people complain about, but if you didn't have those, it would not be the same experience. Like the first movement, this is a bit more like a landscape painting. It kind of stays in one specific mood, I'd say. Although by 4 minutes or so, it does erupt into this wonderful kind of Daphne to Chloe reference, which again, this movement is very Ravelian, where you have a flute run akin to the part from Le Ver du Jour at the beginning, the very famous passage from Daphnis et Chloe, that is rightfully hailed as a master class in orchestration, but I would wager this work is as well. The second movement continues like this for about a minute, and then you return back to the beautiful, very, very contrapuntal theme with winds playing in the background as the violin plays the main theme, which sweeps and sweeps. I mean, you get the main figuration at the beginning, and that's kind of what gets stuck in your head, but for the rest of it, it's like just one giant sweeping melody, and it's so awesome, it's so beautiful. Then it starts to get down to quieter sound, and then you end on just a dying chord, and then it comes back, revives, is played once more. And then we get on to the third movement, which I think will be a lot of your guys' favorite. So the third movement, like the first two, is very idyllic in the way that there's not a whole lot of conflict that we might imagine from music, and also in the way that in some parts it does feel kind of like you're in one specific mood, although that's certainly not true. There is a huge contrast in terms of the sound, although Marx does do what he does in terms of very carefully migrating to the point where no moment is too jarring in the movement. I could almost describe it like you're writing music for a cat that you don't want to get too startled. And I should say, my cat, he's off screen right now. Maybe he'll make an appearance in one video to talk about his taste. But he likes the symphony, and I think it's because a lot of the work that I might listen to, as I said, has a lot more jarring parts where it can kind of get a little creepy for a cat who doesn't like loud noises. But when you have a symphony like this where the loud noises slowly build up and then slowly build back down, that's not as much of a thing. And it's enjoyable for cats, but I think it's also enjoyable for humans. It's a good, easy listening symphony, although when you really pay attention to the themes on a second, third, or in my case probably 63rd listen, then you really notice that there's almost a leitmotivic aspect to the symphony. Because the first part of the clarinet in this movement is a reference to a theme that is very prominent in the finale, that appears throughout the whole finale, and this is the first time you hear it. It's a lot more slowed down, and sometimes it gets overtaken by the strings, but if you pay attention, you notice, hey, I remember that theme. And you don't really notice that until after a few listens. So although it might not be that great in form, like a piece that is very good in form, it's important to listen again because you'll notice a lot of very cool references hidden throughout the symphony that you may not have picked up on the first time, because of course you didn't. Because it appears in the finale. Why would you notice it appeared in the third movement? It's not that prominent in the third movement. So it's so fun to go back over that stuff and see. The main kind of mood in the symphony is characterized by the strings. The strings, for the most part, play something that is almost like a hymn. It's a lot more like a chorale with homophony playing through most of it, and they play a very kind of soft-spoken, retrospective sounding melody that almost causes one to want to go outside and cogitate on life. It's just so beautiful. It's very idyllic, you feel like you're out sitting under a tree thinking about life. And it's probably the one movement that most people would enjoy because of that. It's your typical kind of beautiful string movement. But then, after those three movements, which all individually have very similar characters, you get to the finale. So I think one of the things that makes this symphony very interesting is when you really start thinking about proportions. This symphony is 66 minutes, at least in this recording that I personally recommend from CPO, and it's in 4 movements. So if you think of a traditional 4-movement symphony, it's probably a longer first movement, and then a second movement that's slower and almost as long, a third shorter movement, and then a finale that is a little bit shorter than the first and maybe a little bit longer than the second. So you might imagine it going like 23, 18, 9, and 16 for this symphony in terms of the minutes of each respective movement. This is so not true of this symphony. In fact, it goes 8 minutes, 16 minutes, 16 minutes, and 26 minutes. The finale is longer than the first 2 movements combined. Now, for a symphony by someone like Mahler or Bruckner, you might not worry too much about that. But since we've seen that Joseph Marx can get a little bit monotonous in terms of the mood that he wants to portray, because of the fact that he's mostly aiming for a landscape type of piece, you'll worry that this might be 26 minutes of the same thing, right? No. The first two movements portray probably two different moods. You have a very flowing, almost river-like first movement, and then you have a second movement which is like dancing on a meadow. So then you'll expect at least two different moods from the finale. You get probably 50. That's part of why this work has been played on its own, is because it's the part of the symphony that you can most easily listen to without getting bored. For most of people I've talked to, unfortunately, they don't like the symphony that much. I think part of it has to do with the perceived monotony. The work is ostensibly not that different from maybe what happened a minute or two before or a minute or two after the fact of what you're listening to at that very moment. But really, as I said, it's more that like you're the frog boiling in water and you just don't realize yet. But then, with this movement, it's so different in character. I think it's often called Feste im Herbst, which means a festival in autumn. And you do get that kind of vibe. You definitely feel like there's almost a bit of a party going on by the beginning, with a loud trumpet fanfare and quickly moving strings down below, because what is Joseph Marx without quick moving textures? But really, other than that, and a wonderful, really beautiful melody from like, I think, 10 minutes and 20 seconds into the finale, it's very different in character. You do get a few kind of independent dance scenes, one starting from the beginning, another from about 5, 6, 7 minutes into the finale, and then 10 minutes, and then it goes back to the typical retrospection of the symphony. And it's very, very beautiful. It starts to slowly die down, and by the end, it's absolutely gorgeous. You hear the theme from the very beginning one more time, except instead it is played in major. After evolving to one last giant climax at about 22 minutes and 40 seconds, where you really feel like everything in the forest is coming together frantically, it starts to finally die down. And it ends, as I said, with the main theme in major, and is played in 2 solo violins at one point, then 2 solo clarinets. And it dies down a lot to a slower extent. It dies down to a quieter dynamic, and by the end, you definitely feel like you've just gone on a massive adventure. For me, a good piece of music feels like a good meal. You feel like by the end, you have been completely satisfied, and it feels almost like a deep breath as well, like you can finally exhale after all of it. And that's this symphony. It ends quietly, but you don't at all feel any sense of tragedy. You don't feel any sense of anger. You just feel content. Content with nature and all it has to offer. And how fitting that it is this quiet, sentimental ending that represents the end of the Romantic era as we know it. Thank you for watching.